I'm going to be talking to you today about using your own products. The alternate title of this talk, How I Learned to Stop Dismissing Anecdotal Feedback and Embrace Designing with Opinion. So, like you mentioned, I work for Deliveroo. You might be familiar with us. We work really hard to try to bring good food to customers' hands with convenience, you could say. We've been doing this for about 4 years now, and we've grown to a pretty big size at this point. We're almost 2,000 employees globally, 1,000 of them in the HQ here in London. And we have around 320 people on the tech team, so engineers, product people, myself and my team. And people are often quite surprised by our size when I mention that. But it turns out that the experience of making a product that lets customers find food that they want to eat and track their orders, lets restaurants manage their orders and their business as a whole, then lets writers be in the right place at the right time in order to bring you piping hot food in less than 30 minutes is quite an operation. And that's just when things go right. So we work on 3 completely different applications with 3 completely different users. We got the customer, we've got the writers, and we got the restaurants. And then on top of that, we have a ton of operational tools to help us monitor operation, make sure that everything is going all right, and plan ahead. I work on the writer experience, making sure that our fleet knows when to work, where to go, how to get from A to B in the most efficient manner, and really just enjoy their job as much as possible. I'm going to mute this. Oh, never mind. So writers are the heartbeat of our business. This is something that we say a lot internally, and we really mean it. This is actually the first time that I've had the luxury of working on a product where there's a real coexistence between the user goals and the business goals, being that both as a business and as a writer, what I care about the most is actually getting from where I am to the restaurant, picking up the food, and to the customer as quickly as possible. This has, for me, resulted in an insane fulfillment as a designer. To put things into perspective, when I used to work at Facebook, where users on average globally spend about 5 hours a week on the app. That's pretty insane time spent. But compared to the writer app, where actually our writers work much more than 5 hours a week, you're looking at a completely different tool. So it's much more akin to a productivity tool that actually helps you get your work done. It might be kind of like Sketch in that way, except that Sketch is now 100% of your job, and also it tells you what to do. I made this in jest, but I actually thought it would be kind of fun. So to put things into perspective, think about it like this. Take an app that you use regularly. And now imagine that that app gets 10% better. You have a 10% improvement in one part of the flow. How do you feel about that? Cool. That's not bad. It's a little more sleek now, maybe a little bit easier to use. But if I can make you 10% faster at your job, how does that make you feel? That means that all of a sudden, if you work an 8-hour day, you've gained 48 minutes of your day. That would make a difference to my day for sure. Now, if you could take that time and actually give yourself a 10% pay rise, then that has a pretty massive impact on your life. I might feel a little bit more like that. So the moral of the story is that our 10% improvements actually have huge impact on real people's lives. This isn't just some app that I use. This is actually how I earn a living, how I put myself through school, or how I care for my family. This means that it's both incredibly challenging, but also very exciting to work on. And this is what I'm going to talk to you about today. So, because you're responsible for someone else's livelihood, there's a lot at stake. You can no longer afford to really take a backseat approach to the design process. So how do we go about doing this? Well, first of all, obviously, we use research. We have a world-class UX team and they're really good at their job, and I would love to just spend this whole talk boasting about the work that they do. But that's not actually my field. So instead, I want to talk to you about something that we can all do and all contribute to, which is doing it yourself. So you might have heard of this before as dog fooding. It basically means that it comes from like eating your own dog food. I like to think of it that if I owned a dog food factory, I would be willing to eat the product that I produce. However, as much as I love dogs, I'm also not really comfortable comparing our product to dog food, and I'm definitely not comfortable comparing our users to dogs. So I prefer to think of it more as the term using, and talking about using and elevating the word use to a new level. So I will say that as a company, we're pretty good at using our own product. As my coworker Josh here mentions, it really pays off. So the problem then, or I guess like it's easy to use your product when it means that you're getting delicious food delivered to your home or your office. And that means that as a company, and probably all of you guys, we're all very aware of what it feels like to sit at home, you're super hangry, and something goes wrong with your order, and it puts you through a lot of frustration. We can easily have empathy with that situation. But how can we ensure that this also stretches to our other users, our writers, the restaurant managers, the chefs themselves? How can we have the same empathy for their work? Internally, we've developed a set of design principles that champion this. One of them, which is go out and empathize. That's what the poster looks like. And what does that actually mean? Well, it means that obviously we go out and we really care about getting firsthand perspective of what it's like to be in this position as a user. At this point, you might be, okay, cool, we all do that. And maybe you do. I don't know how you use your product, and I assume that you know your product inside out, as we all do. We have to work on it and build it after all. But I've also seen a lot of companies that claim to understand their product, yet have little understanding of what the user actually goes through when they're using it, which might be a little bit more like that. Basically, I think that if you're not constantly frustrated and annoyed with your product, you're either not using it enough or you're using it wrong. So this comes down then to using your product, or basically just going through the motions of doing so, and actually putting yourself in the position of the user. One way to think about the difference here is, say that you work for an online marketplace. You can go through the motions of setting up a shop. You can go through the flow, and you can make a name, and you can add some dummy items, and you can understand from like a UX and UI perspective what it's like to set up a shop. But you can also put yourself in the user's perspective, which might be that they have a craft that they're incredibly passionate about, have spent hours throughout their entire life dedicating themselves to, and that they want to sell in order to make a living. So they spend hours coming up with like a shop name and a concept and struggling with the actual realities of reaching customers, dealing with logistics, figuring out how to do shipping, trying to make a profit, and generally like managing a business. Now, the former use case of just going through the motions will teach you about the flow. It will let you identify inefficiencies and improve the usability and generally make things better. But the latter is what's going to actually give you the perspective of what it's like to be a user. Which means you'll identify the real struggles. And these are the bits that are going to make you want to set your computer on fire. So it's not just like which parts of the UI weren't working well enough, but real-life problems with real-life opportunities, such as teaching them how to stand out on the launch website, teaching them how to do product photography better, or maybe building tools to help them manage finance or taxes or whatever might come with operating your own business. So at this point, you can easily say that this is what research is supposed to be doing, because anecdotal data is useless, right? Well, I get that, and it's true that rule number one is you are not your user. You will never be your user. We talk about this a lot as an industry, and I think that we all kind of know what's embedded in this. But the second part of it is that the user isn't you. And what do I mean by that? Well, if we first go back to this statement, this means that I am biased and I'm privileged. My living is not dependent on the product that I build. I make a comfortable salary, and I'll never know what it's actually like to have, my entire financial well-being dependent on this app. If I break my leg, I'll actually be fine. Second, I also know way too much about the product. So I know what our roadmap is. I know what the technical constraints are. I know what the legal constraints are that are keeping us from doing certain things that we might want to do. And I can't get away from that. And it will make me see the product in a totally different light. And lastly, I'm pretty good at tech. I have a much better understanding of probably computers than your average user does, which will always give me a really biased view. But this is also actually your strength. You're a professional product person, which means that you're going to see your product by using it in a completely different light than the user is. It means that you're trained to think about it in a different way. So if any of you guys have ever had the experience of using an app that you haven't worked on, being incredibly frustrated by it, and then coming up with a list of ideas for improvements and ways that they could improve their app, then you are not an average user, because normal people don't do that. They kind of stop at the frustration. Which means that you will see opportunities that a normal user won't consider. You'll see things that they would never tell you in user research, because they have a tendency to blame themselves for any confusion that they experience, instead of blaming the product itself. And that means that you can see potential and how to overcome those limitations that normal people won't see. And this is why I think it's so important that you embed yourself within your product and really use it so that you can be emotionally invested in it. Otherwise, you might get things like this. You might all be familiar with this feature, Facebook on this day. It shows you things that you've posted in the past on this day previously. And usually, most of the time, the worst thing that it does is remind me that I've been on Facebook for 11 years and I'm getting pretty old. So it's all fun and games until all of a sudden it's Valentine's Day and it surfaces a picture with your ex. Less fun. So this is an inherent danger with building products without understanding the emotional feelings that users actually go through. If you're only thinking about it logically, you're missing out on these reactions that people will have that they cannot help. And the thing about us is that, without trivializing anyone's life experience, if you're in this room, you're likely to have a good job, you're likely to be educated, and maybe you've had a pretty good life, meaning that you'll miss out on many of the struggles that your users have experienced, which leads to greater opportunities for gross oversights like this. Emotional edge cases are easily overlooked and often way more important to look at than technical edge cases. So this didn't actually happen to me, not this time around anyway, but this was actually posted by an ex-Facebook employee in a group for ex-Facebook employees. And what I thought was so fascinating about it is that she doesn't just react by being angry or just making this feature want to go away, which if a regular user has a negative emotional reaction to something, they might just want to dismiss the whole thing whatsoever. Instead, she proposes algorithmic improvements that could prevent this from happening in the first place, which, frankly, I can't believe wasn't already implemented. And this is the perspective that you can offer that no one else can. You need to put yourself to the best of your abilities, directly in the user's shoes. It's the only way that you can prevent things from happening. Even worse was a few years ago when Facebook's similar year in review feature made the assumption that everyone's year was worthy of celebration. I think this is like such a stereotypical Silicon Valley perspective that we should all like celebrate our failures. But it completely neglects the fact that actually a lot of people had horrible years, such as Eric Mayer here, who lost his daughter and was met with this upon going on Facebook.com, full of confetti. These are big losses. These are small nuances with huge consequences. The flip side of this are tiny wins that you can also identify. The same ability that lets you pick up the nuances of product frustrations will also let you identify opportunities to add emotional celebration. And sometimes that's literal celebration. When I first joined Deliveroo, I was tasked with finding a way of increasing writer tips. I added a feature that made confetti come up when you tip writers, and it worked. People tip more if you give them a feeling of emotional celebration in response to their actions. In other cases, is things like a small icon that can make a world of difference. Joel Khalifa here, who's a designer at GitHub, shipped a tiny icon change and got what I would claim is a pretty massive reaction of love to literally just swapping an icon, because he cleared up what was a massive user confusion, but no one had ever mentioned it because they assumed that it was their fault for not being able to keep track of which dropdown was which. And this is exactly why we need you on the ground fighting the good fight. So how can we be better at discovering these opportunities? Well, first of all, there's data and research. And those are really great. Like, I love designing with data, and I obviously value research incredibly highly. But I've also been at companies where wars have been fought over which one is better, of like qualitative research or quantitative data. And in my opinion, the answer is neither is good without the third element. Our product cycle that is just built on doing research, iterating on the product, and then collecting data on the findings will always just be an iterative process. It will give you linear growth, and it will help you get from 0 to 0.1. It will probably be a good product if you follow this cycle for enough time, but it will also overlook some of the most important parts of the data, the research, and your own personal experiences too, which in my opinion is strong opinions. So yes, everyone has opinions, and many of them are bad, which is why it's really important to have informed opinions, to be willing to back them up by experiences, and also be able to pivot and change them once you're proven wrong. And I think to do so, to do this right, you have to elevate what opinions looks like. You have to give it the same gravitas that you might to a data report or a research finding. With open mind and willingness to be proven wrong, but a strong direction, I think that this is the vision that's going to help you get from 0 to 1. And that's how you're going to build a great product. So with that, where do we go from here? This is really about getting into the trenches. This is about feeling the pain that the user feels, and it's about using it until you wish that you didn't have to use this piece of shit software anymore. In order to do so, you have to be invested. You have to have something at stake. So when you're doing this, you have to put yourself in the user's shoes and think, what's at stake for this here? Am I trying to make my living? Am I trying to feed my family? Am I trying to get my business off the ground? What does success look like in that framework? And what do I need from the product in order to get there? You also need to step away from the computer. I mean, if you work on B2B tools where you're sitting on the computer and your user is sitting on the computer, this is a little different. But in the case where you're working on an app that puts you inside of the real world, you have to actually be where your user is when you're using it in order to consider what it's like to be in that environment. You have to leave your filter bubble, which might mean traveling to other markets that are completely different from yours, or it might be putting yourself into the mind of a different demographic. And most of all, you should be suffering a little, or a lot. One example of how we did this at Deliveroo, where we had people, suffering. was we frequently heard from writers that it's incredibly annoying to be stuck waiting at restaurants. This is when you show up and the food's not ready yet, and you have to wait for the restaurant to finish cooking the food before you can take off again. We knew that this made writers really frustrated, and the frustration makes total sense. We also saw it reflected across the board in calls to writer support and in the research findings and our own experiences. And we totally understood. I mean, why wouldn't you be impatient? So this was kind of what we were expecting that writers felt, but it wasn't until we experienced the issue firsthand that we saw that actually there was much more involved in that. You don't need to be a writer to understand that waiting at a restaurant when you're getting paid per drop is going to make you impatient. But actually going out there and doing it yourself helped us experience that it's a lot more emotionally nuanced than that. When I did it firsthand, I realized that I wasn't just impatient, I was just warm. I'd just been outside cycling in the cold winter weather, and all of a sudden I'm in a hot, crowded restaurant, and I'm sweaty, and I'm gross, and I'm uncomfortable. I also felt incredibly awkward because I'm wearing this giant box on my back, and I keep getting in everyone's way, and I kind of don't really know what to do with myself as I'm standing in there. And on top of that, I'm actually genuinely worried because I left my bike locked up outside. And even though I locked the tire and the frame together, I couldn't find anywhere to actually lock it to. And so I'm standing in the restaurant, constantly trying to glance out the window and make sure that it's still there and no one's run off with it yet. So even though we've shipped the first tool to deal with this now that lets writers address the impatience, that lets them report long waits and reject orders that are taking too long, we realized through this that we've actually only solved one of these 4 emotions that we were feeling, that writers are feeling when they're at the restaurant. And that's when you can really start to brainstorm. How can we address the physicality of being hot inside of a restaurant? How can we improve safety? How can we just make it clearer what you're supposed to do and maybe not force you to go into the restaurant at all? So this is how you can incorporate this into your own design process. You just look at data to understand what the world currently is. You do the research to understand what's wrong with the world. But then you form an opinion for a better world. And you can do this by documenting your experiences, thinking about how did this experience make me feel? How can I convey those feelings to my stakeholders and everyone else in the business? And how does what I felt compare to how we wanted you to feel? And maybe, how did I actually want to feel? So at Deliveroo, here's how we've done it in practice. The first time that I went out writing, I was absolutely terrified. And that experience alone made me realize that you might need a lot more hand-holding than necessary. But getting out there on the road taught me so much, and I wrote up a big report, and I published it to the whole company, really detailing the entire emotional journey that I felt along the way. And it really resonated with people, breaking it down into everything from how much money I made, how far I cycled, and how I felt about the whole thing has really helped us quantify these emotional experiences that our writers go through. At one point, I took my whole team out in an SUV driving around the streets of London, which is also a journey, but maybe a slightly different one. When we go out of town on research, we bring our bikes, and we make sure that we know what it's like to actually write in every market and not just London, because it's a completely different experience. So I think the important part here is not just doing it, but also being able to convey what it's like to do it to the rest of the company. And you can choose yourself what the most effective medium of doing this is, but for me, I find that a combination of writing, of photography, of videos is really the best way to make this come across. More so, I'm really lucky to be in a team that really values this. I did not invent this by any means. I'm really just the last one to jump on a bandwagon full of people that genuinely care about the writer experience and who travel the world, do this, we test new features, we see what it's really like to do it. Every Friday, anyone can go out for a lunch ride, and we organize this together. And our CEO, Will Shu, still delivers 1 order a week to make sure that he's in touch with what it's like to be a writer. And we do this because this is our jobs. And I think that this is your job as well. Because here's the thing, like as a designer, you have an opportunity to see things that no one else will see. So I want you to pay attention. I want you to get your hands dirty. And I want you to trust your instincts and convey this to your stakeholders. Develop an opinion and see it through. Because as a designer, I think that this is your greatest strength. Just kidding. I care that you care. I also look for designers that are passionate about the work that they do and are able to communicate said passion. I think there are a few skills that are as valuable as the ability to communicate for a designer. We're all storytellers at the base of it all. But it also doesn't matter how well you can communicate problems if you can't solve them, then you're just a complainer. And you also need to be able to solve your problems with pragmatism. Make the right trade-offs, as many have discussed here today, and use these 4 skills wisely. Your job is so much more than just drawing rectangles on a screen and doing iterative improvements. This is actually your superpower. And I think you'll be amazed by how easy it is to win people over once you take them through the emotional journey of the user. And your company and your users will thank you for it. And this is where I go to the, there we go.